Hello and welcome to this special author interview for FanFiAddict. I'm Frasier Armitage, part-time robot, full-time nerd, and joining me today is the Locus Award-winning, absolutely immensely talented author of The Mountain in the Sea and The Tusks of Extinction, which came out yesterday, and it's so good. It is, of course, Ray Nayler. Ray, how are you doing?
Hey, doing well. How are you?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, really excited to talk about the Tusks of Extinction. And to anybody who's joining us, who's listening in as well, welcome. Feel free to post in the comments. And if you've got questions for Ray, then we'll try and incorporate them as we discuss his latest book.
Yeah.
So Ray, for anybody who's maybe tuning in who's not familiar with you and your work, maybe just give us a little bit about your origin story and about the kind of stuff that you enjoy writing.
Oh, okay. Let's see. So I was born in Quebec, raised in California. I left the United States in 2003 for the Peace Corps in Turkmenistan, having never traveled abroad. That was my sort of first destination overseas. So after Turkmenistan, I lived in Russia, and then in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan. Let's see, after Kyrgyzstan was Afghanistan, and then Russia again, and then Tajikistan, where I joined the Foreign Service. And after joining the Foreign Service, my first post was in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and then Kyrgyzstan again, and then Azerbaijan, and then Kosovo, and then finally back, having made my way very, very slowly west, skipping all of Western Europe, back to the U.S. So that's me. I started publishing a long time ago, really, when I was just graduated from high school. So I published my first short story in a literary magazine when I was 19, and then had a big gap after having published like a novella and a lot of short stories in the kind of crime fiction world, because I was overseas and it was difficult to submit and things like that. But then when electronic submissions came around and I started submitting to magazines again, I submitted to Asimov's and was lucky enough to get a short story published with them. And that's how I started in science fiction. So that was in 2015, not so terribly long ago. So it's been less than a decade. And then The Mountain in the Sea came out in 2022. And the Tusks of Extinction still doesn't seem real that it's out in the world, but came out yesterday.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And congrats on the Locus Award for The Mountain in the Sea. I loved that book. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And I was curious as to how you were going to follow it up because I enjoyed it so much. And then reading the Tusks of Extinction, I was just like, oh, this is perfect. It's the perfect follow-up to that book. I loved it. And did you always have that in mind that this was going to be the next story you were going to release? Or was it just like a really happy coincidence?
No, I really didn't. I think I came up with the idea for the Tusks of Extinction in the gap between I had finished The Mountain in the Sea, I had sold it, so I had an agent, I had my publisher lined up, and I was done with all the edits, and then I came up with the idea for Tusks. I was just reading. I think I was reading an article actually on the industry in gathering, like unearthing mammoth tusks in Siberia and up in the Russian far north. And I started getting the sort of ideas that would coalesce into the Tusks of Extinction. So no, I really didn't know that was going to be my next story. And I think my agent would have preferred I didn't write a next story that was specifically about animals again, but that's just sort of how it worked. So I do have another novel which is nearing completion now. I'm sort of in edits, but it's already sold, and that one will not be about animals because you can only write so many books about big charismatic animals before people start thinking that's all you can do.
Yeah, you'd be like Gerald Durrell, but for sci-fi, like the animal guy. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The thing that I loved about what comes through the book, though, is one of the same things that I loved about The Mountain in the Sea and carries over into this is the passion that you have for this type of story and this type of storytelling. How important is it for you as an author to be sort of rooted in your passions when you get an idea, you know, that it spawns from something that means something to you? Is that part of your process?
Yeah, I think this has been really consistent since I started writing when started consistently writing when I was about 16. I've always had to write about something that I really cared about, whether it was like a political issue or an environmental issue or something. There had to be some kind of nugget, like some sort of seed of irritation, with something that kind of built up into a story. And I know that's not the same for all writers, and I don't expect that every single book out there has to have some big concern, but that's kind of what pushes me forward, I think. And I've tried to just write without having something like that pushing on me, and I just can't do it.
Yeah, it's true. And I think especially in speculative fiction, it's such a broad and massive, it can encapsulate so many things that if you're not writing about the things that are important to you, it almost seems like where do you start with something like that? So yeah, it's brilliant. And I remember you've been on panels before and given advice about talking about like the big issues, like Sci-Fi and that kind of thing. Is it being particularly relevant? And I thought, well, that's one of the things about the Tusks of Extinction. It is so relevant, and that's what it felt like. Was it always intended to have that feeling of of being almost like a motivational kind of piece for people reading it?
Yeah, I think so. When I was in Ho Chi Minh City, I worked a little bit on rhino horn trafficking and on elephant tusk trafficking. And I don't think I ever thought I would write about it necessarily, but I feel like it left like a mark on me. It was really frustrating work because it wasn't like a battle you were going to win, and you sort of knew that the odds were stacked against any sort of enforcement of these things. And I think when I started Tusks, I wasn't necessarily thinking that it was going to tie back into those things, but it was impossible for me to write about mammoths without writing about elephants. And I kind of realized that, well, I want to avoid spoilers, but I'll say that somewhat like the main character, let's say, I realized that those two things were very connected for me as well. And there really wasn't any getting away from the real world. I couldn't write a novel that was just like a happy story about mammoths, knowing what I did about human beings and about the elephant tusk trafficking, and then also about the trade in mammoth ivory in Siberia and in the Russian far north. So it was inevitable, I think, that it was going to end up there, whether I wanted it to be there or not.
Yeah, and it's even though it's a story about mammoths, is a very human story, and I think that you can tell that there is that humanity and that connection to what you're writing about, and because it hits places that go beyond sort of the wildlife documentary TV shows. It
Right.
gets to something more human, which is again something that a lot of your readers who will have picked up Mountain in the Sea, it's exactly the kind of thing that they'll have loved about that will be the same with this. You mentioned about your main character, about Damira. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Is that right?
That was it. Yeah.
Awesome. So how fun was it getting inside Damira's head for this particular project? And again, not wanting to give any spoilers, but I imagine it was quite a fun process for you for your imagination to go on.
Yeah, it was an interesting process. I had a lot of people to kind of model her on. She's of Russian citizenship, but she's a Tatar, and she's from an area of Russia that I have been to and know well, and so it was a little bit like a chance to revisit some of my time in that part of Russia, and then some of the people that I knew, and kind of build them into her, and then some of the places that I'd been. So it was fun. It was also, I really like the opportunity when I can to have scientists in science fiction, which I think is something that isn't done enough lately. Especially, it seems like we've gotten away a little bit from the science part of things sometimes. So it's nice to bring science, like a scientist, in as a character when it can be done smoothly. And yeah, she was a lot of fun to write, but she was also a lot of she took on her own character very quickly, and that's something that was interesting about the Tusks of Extinction for me, is that of all the things that I think I've written, this one seemed most like it wrote itself. Like, it was never an effort to write, and I was never pushing up against anything. It was really like the characters were just enacting scenes, and I was kind of recording them as best as I could on the page. But it really felt as if Damira came to life for me, and all of the characters in the story really came to life. And it's not even an indication of quality, because I've had books and short stories where the characters, I had to really struggle with them, and I had to do a lot of work to get them to feel correct to me. And I always felt like I was leading the way and sort of pulling everything behind me. And then the end result was really good. And then I've had, stories where they were incredibly easy to write and terrible when they were finished. So hard and easy is not an indication of the quality that a story will be in the end. But this one was just particularly strikingly fluid. Like, I just, it felt effortless in this way I haven't had very many things feel.
Yeah, and did that help when it came to figuring out how long the story should be? Because it's a novella length, and obviously Mountain in the Sea was longer, was the full novel. What sort of, was that always, again, I'm talking about always the plan, but did you always intend for it to come out as a novella, or did it just happen that way?
So this book was planned as a novella, and it was actually sold before it was written. So I sold this one on a synopsis. Well, I should say my agent sold it on a synopsis, and so the synopsis was written before the novella was written, but the length was planned from the start. I find it's a really nice length. I feel like if I could, I would write like half novels and then spend the other half of the time in the short story and novella world. It's very comfortable for me because I came from short stories, and so my tendency is always to condense, right? And so I feel like I can put into 30,000 words, 100,000 words of material, precisely because I've learned to put 10,000 words of material into 5,000 words or 2,500 words. Like, I've really learned to trim, cut down, condense, and like make compact as much as I can. And the result with The Mountain in the Sea was that you had 460 pages or so of like really compact material. Like, there's a lot in those pages, and with this, I feel like the result is, I feel as if there's a novel's worth of thematic material and character development and that kind of thing in this novella, and that it seemed like for this story it was the perfect length. There was too much there for a short story, but if I trimmed all of the fat away and just left the lean parts of the narrative, it was really, really kind of perfectly came out at 30,000 words.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that you can sense that when you're reading it as well. So my experience of reading the book, it zipped by, but I was thinking about the book as I was reading it. So I got to the end of it and I felt like I hadn't read 30,000. I felt like I'd read a novel, even though it was because it stirs so much. It gets you thinking about so many different things and putting pieces together and stuff. And I thought it was really, really well done. Now that you've written, because you've got so much experience with short stories, now that you've written a novel, are there any kind of skills that kind of cross over from one to the other, or do you need a different skill set for each, do you think?
I mean, I think that so I'm taking a drawing class just out of my own interest, and one of the really interesting things that my drawing instructor said is that you don't learn to draw a hand, and you don't learn to draw like a face. You don't learn to draw, a book or a table. You learn to draw. And the skills that you gain in learning to draw are the same skills that you'll learn to draw anything that you set your mind to drawing. And that kind of blew me away, because when you're a kid and you learn to draw a thing, right? Like, you don't learn to draw, you learn to draw people, and then you learn to draw a car, and you learn to draw a cat, and you concentrate on learning how to do these individual things. And I think sometimes in writing you feel like you're doing that too, like you're learning to write a poem, you're learning to write a short story. But I've always been comfortable across many different genres and across many different types of writing, and so I feel like the things that make a short story great are the same things that make a novel great. There are differences in sort of the techniques you use, how much space you have, and all of those things affect the way that you might go about things. But for me, the basic elements are virtually the same. When I write a novel, I quite often sort of think of each chapter as being a story. Like, each chapter has to have a beginning and a middle and an end. And then I'm also of the mind that each chapter has to kind of thematically contain the whole book. So it needs to be a reflection of everything that's in the book. You're sort of repeating, you're hitting the same themes in different ways and from different angles. And that's what you do in a short story as well, except that in a short story, you tend to do it twice or three times in the space of a story. You kind of have your theme and you hit it 1, 2, 3 times and you're done. Whereas in a novel, you have an opportunity to come at it from so many different directions and do it in so many different ways. But I don't think the basic techniques, at least for me, change.
Yeah, I love that analogy of like you just learn to draw, and it's the same of like you just learn to write. I love that. That's brilliant. And with the drawing, what's prompted that? What's inspired that? Is it something you've always wanted to do, or is there something you're doing it for?
Yeah, I had a little bit of time in my schedule, and I really wanted to learn a skill that I, first of all, had very little experience in. I mean, I drew the same way anyone else did growing up, and maybe a little more. I mean, I really liked art and drawing and things like that. But then as an adult, I barely ever drew anything. And I wanted to learn something new and something that I wasn't particularly invested in, that I didn't have like a reason to know, and I wasn't trying to prove anything. I mean, I think one of the terribly sad things that happens when you become an adult is you sort of stop doing the things that you aren't good at, and you start concentrating on the things that you're good at, right? So you never completely learned to draw. Maybe you just sort of did it, you doodled on the side. When you're an adult, you kind of stop doing that. You concentrate on the things that are going to help you earn a living or whatever, or what are going to become your sort of core hobbies. And I thought it would just be nice to learn a new skill and not feel like, I had anything to prove. And I have to tell you, I mean, I have this 3-hour class every week. I'm starting a second session of it next week too, and it's just wonderful. It's a lovely feeling just to stand there at the easel and draw, and not have to worry about publication and all these other things. And what are people going to think of my drawing on Goodreads? Like, all 1 stars, I'm sure. But right, none of that is in the back of my mind. I'm just enjoying myself. It's really nice.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, I was thinking it wouldn't be Goodreads. I was like, what would it be? And then you're looking at a drawing, but good looks wouldn't be that. It wouldn't be that, would it? No, that's really, really nice to hear. And is it nice just doing something of a different aspect of creativity? Because obviously you've got this outlet for creativity with your writing, but just doing it slightly different. Is that giving you something back as well?
Yeah, and I think like I was saying, I learned these things in drawing class that I feel like are applicable to writing as well. Like, I had never had thought about that idea that, really with me as a writer, I just learned to write. Like I didn't really concentrate on a single form. I just learned about how to put a sentence together. I mean, that's really it. It's kind of like the minimum sort of writing element that includes grammar and syntax and vocabulary and can really tell a story is the sentence. And once you learn how to make a good sentence, you can do anything with it, right? And it's a little bit like in drawing, the one thing that they concentrate on is the quality of your line, right? And learning how to make an authoritative sort of a strong, clear line that's expressive. And once you have that expressive line, that's a tool that you can take to almost anything that you draw, because that's how you tell a story. With drawing is line, volume, all those things, rhythm, and sort of the same with writing. So that was an insight. I also think like, all creative people, all writers are simply creative people, like who have chosen writing over other forms of expression. The same way that photographers or painters they've chosen a medium, but at the core of that is a need to communicate, a willingness to take risk, a curiosity about the world, those same kind of qualities that make for any creative person, and honestly, that make for many creative people who never do anything that anyone would consider particularly artistic in one field or another, right? Like there are creative people who are just creative parents, right? Who are just, creative about how they live their lives in general, and that their medium is just the entirety of living a creative existence in the world. So there is definitely that, like you feel like it's not the skills that carry across, but the sensibility carries across to other things. The wanting to tell a story and the understanding, how stories are told certainly carries across. But yeah, it's not for anything except for enrichment, and I think that's one of the things that we kind of lack, especially honestly here in the United States, where just seems like you can quickly lose years of your life chasing after your schedule. It's nice to do something that's purely for enjoyment.
Yeah, definitely. And that's part of the pleasure of what we all get as readers as well, isn't it? It's, you read to enrich yourself and to enjoy it. And nobody who sits down with a book and thinks, right, okay, I have to read this and I'm not going to enjoy it. That book just gets closed and never finished. But the ones who love reading, it opens worlds to them. And I guess it's seeing that with fresh eyes must be really nice, to think of the impact you have as someone who's skilled as a writer, to be able to bring that enjoyment to others. Does that ever sort of get old, that feeling?
No, that never gets old. I mean, I genuinely think that. So a lot of people say, or present writing as this very lonely act. It's certainly something that is done alone, and ideally alone, because really, a lot of things are distracting, to your writing process. But I never feel alone when I'm writing. I always feel like I'm in conversation with someone, and I'm very much invested, as you know, in semiotics and these other fields. And one of the things about semiotics is something that is a good lesson to remember about the act of reading and the act of writing. And that's that, a stop sign, right, becomes a sign only in the moment when a person driving a car sees that stop sign and then recognizes what it means and executes what the stop sign is telling them. That's the only moment in which it's a sign. At all other times, when it's not being read, it's a potential sign, right? So, a stop sign on Mars, right, being read by a species that has no common experience with us, is not a stop sign. It's not a sign to stop a car. It might be a sign that there's alien life for them somewhere else in the universe, right? But it's certainly not a sign that they should stop. And similarly, books come alive only in the act of reading them. And I think that's kind of like this overlooked everyday magic of what reading is, which is that they are inert and they really, in some ways, literally don't exist on the shelf when their pages are closed. And it's only when a mind is applied to the act of reading that this story comes to life. And I thought, especially in the anxious days when Mountain in the Sea was first coming into the world, and you really kind of worried about how books are going to be received, it was nice every once in a while just to take a moment to think about how in hundreds or thousands of different places across the planet this book was being read, and each one of those readings was this little performance in the theater of someone's mind of this book, and how truly spectacular that is. I mean, it really is magic, and it gives you a sense of wonder and of responsibility too, and I think that never really leaves me, and that's what inspires me to keep going, is this sense that you're always in conversation with that reader, and it's always a conversation between two people, really. It's you and someone else, and it really is also true that every instance of reading a book is a different instance, right? It's a different thing. You never really have the same book twice, which is not to say that there's wild variation, because you're within the limits of what's been written on the page, but people bring so much to that. They see it differently. They bring experiences that you didn't have. They bring things to the book that you may never have thought of, and the story that eventually happens in their mind is really a collaboration between writer and reader, and no two of those collaborations are exactly alike. And I think that's also fantastic. I mean, in general, the written word is such an amazing and powerful tool, and to have practiced wielding it for so long and finally feel like you can do it moderately well is a great thing. It was worth all the effort.
Because you're bringing something to the conversation in a different kind of way as when you're a reader, aren't you? Because as a reader, you're part of that conversation, but as a writer, you're the other side of it too, and it's a really good thing. My big request for you is that if you ever get to open a library, please call it a stop sign on Mars. That would be the best. It was, yeah, I love it.
That would be a great name. Yeah, totally.
The thing that you were mentioning there is about the responsibility of us as writers, and I think that that's a really interesting thing to think about as well, because of the power that storytelling has. Do you think that storytelling and speculative fiction will play a role in issues like conservation and de-extinction and these kinds of things as we face them in the future?
I think that writing in general has impact in the world, and the impact is real. It's not always easy to predict what will have impact and what will just pass by the wayside without making a physical real change in the world. But I think that you can't get away from the fact that writing has real power, and that writing really has changed the world before and will now, and you never know where it's really going to come from, that book or that idea that gets out there and makes some kind of an alteration. I mean, I sometimes say about Mountain in the Sea that the one thing I hear people say again and again is, I'll never eat octopus, right? Again, that's kind of like some people's response to the novel is just, I'll never eat octopus. And I was sort of thinking between the two things of winning a Locus Award, which was very nice, and 10,000 octopuses not being eaten, right? Which one is a more important effect for me of the Mountain in the Sea? And clearly, I think it is 10,000, octopuses not being eaten, or maybe just people looking animals in the eye a little more and seeing them as intelligent, beings. And I'm not speaking as a vegan or something like that, and I'm not, right? And I'm a just as flawed and confused about these things as anyone else. But if the effect of the book is simply that people start thinking a little bit more deeply about human beings and our relationship with the environment, I think that would be wonderful. And I don't think it's fiction's place to necessarily like hammer an answer into people's heads, but it really is to open up this space and ask these questions, and then get the reader involved in questioning themselves and the world that we live in. I think that's the really interesting part for me of writing. But that being said, there are interesting things about writing that have nothing to do with trying to change the world. There's lots you can do with a fantasy novel that doesn't have anything to do about changing people's opinions, but just has to do with entertaining them, right?
Yeah, definitely. Because that's the thing. It's got such a broad spectrum of what you can do with a story. And what's really lovely about your writing is that it achieves that what you set out to do for it, because it isn't preachy and it isn't you getting on a soapbox. It's raising questions and making people go introspective and think, right, okay, what's my feelings about this? And one of the ways that you did that beautifully in the Tusks of Extinction was the perspective of the hunters and the people who are hunting these mammoths. And was it, with all your experiences and the things that you've seen, like we talked about at the start, was it difficult to get inside that perspective as you were writing it?
No, actually, writing from the perspective of the poachers was really easy, because I think I understand very well why people do destructive things most of the time, and most of the time it's done out of a sense of desperation or wanting to get something that cannot be had, and I don't see, I think there are very few villains in the world. I think it's really difficult to really find one. I can think of a few, but I can only think of a few. And most people who commit crimes or do terrible things, even terrible things like poaching elephants and real life crimes like that, are doing them for reasons that may even be honorable at their core, right? Doing them to do things like feed their families, right? Or take care of the people that they care about, or just make enough money to survive. I mean, poachers themselves are not going to be the ones raking in the huge profits. It's systems that rake in huge profits. It's things like banks and cartels and these kinds of things that are sort of detached from individual human experience. And so, for me, writing from that perspective of a person kind of forced into this bad situation and then making bad choices is also easy, because I've been in bad situations and made bad choices. I mean, I'm not, I graduated from high school with a 1.86 GPA at the bottom of my class, having barely clawed my way out of that system, right? And thinking that I was not academic and wouldn't succeed. And then I got to college and realized that there was a world out there in which you could choose what you wanted to learn about, and you could actually engage in a completely different way with professors on terms of respect and equality, where they treated you like an adult. And all of a sudden I was on the honors roll and on the dean's list and doing really well. So I understand what it is to be like a juvenile delinquent that everybody thinks is gonna fail because you just don't fit into whatever system exists. And I can draw on that negativity and those feelings of anger and rage and the poor choices that you make because of them, to draw those characters well. And I have a deep sympathy, I think, for them, for all of the characters and all of the different perspectives. In this book in particular, I have a very deep sympathy, because I think that everyone in this book is just trying to do what they believe is right.
Yeah, and they're all coming up against things that are making it difficult for them, and then seeing them, the way they handle it is seeing yourself, isn't it? Because we all see that. We all see how we're trying to exist in a flawed system, which is really, really, and that's part of the humanity of the book. I love it. I love it. I think what you were saying then about choosing what you learn about. I know that in the acknowledgements you'd said that you did an awful lot of research into elephants, even though you already had a really good foundational knowledge of it. When you were doing all of that research, is there anything that you came across that either surprised you or that, the best thing that stands out in your mind that you learned about elephants as you were researching for the book?
I learned about how they, and this is still somewhat theoretical in the science, but how they may actually be able to communicate through the ground, and through their bones, and hear each other kilometers away through these like rumbling, sort of subsonic rumbles that they make. That was really fascinating. And then learning how they have this organ in their mouth that allows them to taste and probably remember, from taste, I think was a really interesting thing. But in general, just the research into elephants reminded me of what an extraordinary animal they are, right? And they're also one of these animals. I think one of the things that people maybe even forget is that there was a time in which we had a lot more contact with elephants, kind of throughout humanity's spread, right? So there were elephants in Europe, in some of the armies, right? There would have been elephants, as far north as Germany. A lot of people may have seen or gone to see an elephant that passed through their, village. And these were animals that bore an extraordinary sense of wonder, but they were also they were also a technology, right? And that's an interesting part of the elephant's history with mankind, is that the elephant, for the human being throughout a significant portion of our history, is a war machine, right? And that our experience of the elephant is the experience of the juggernaut, right? Like this gigantic war machine that was used to crush Alexander's advances into Afghanistan, right? And that was used to cross the Alps, to attack the Roman Empire. I mean, it has a history with mankind that's fascinating and closely woven into our pretty recent in human time conflicts with one another. And so, I think there is something also about the elephant that is a little bit, now that we only see them in zoos and it's a very sanitized kind of thing, our mutual history and the negativity and sort of dual-sidedness of that mutual history with the elephant is somewhat neglected, right?
Yeah, definitely. And even when you think about the design of a tank, it shares a lot in common with the shape of an elephant, doesn't it?
Right.
And you think about, so we've got a zoo not far from here which has elephants, and when you spend time looking at them, you see the family bond that exists within it really strong.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just such a delight to see, and I think that's why they're such fascinating creatures to write about and to think about, because like you say, they remember, and it makes them really, really stand out among the animal kingdom. Just on the lines of other animals, so in your books, you've talked to octopuses and you've talked to elephants. Is there another animal that if you could pick, and you say, right, you're going to gain intelligence and I'm going to have a chat with you, which animal would you pick?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm really interested in. I mean, the Tusks of Extinction is kind of about this, about the embodiment of meaning, and how the way in which your physical body is shaped and the way that we are in the world has so much to do with the way that we think. I think I would really love to understand the perspective of the world from the perspective of a whale, right? For example, I mean, these are really that's just such a completely different way to view life and motion and all of these things. So definitely whales are fascinating. And then all the recent stuff in the media with the killer whale was very interesting, since a lot of people forget that a killer whale is just a giant dolphin, right? And so, like, we're really talking about is very big, very powerful dolphins, right? And so, I think a lot of people were, because of the name of the killer whale, interpreting their acts as being violent or sort of having to do with pain. But there's some pretty good evidence that came out right about the time the media was losing interest in all of this, that this was play, in fact, right? And that all that was happening was that they had been doing this sometimes in the Arctic as well, and what they were doing was disabling the boat so that the human being they wanted to get attention from couldn't get away from them. A little bit the way that my daughter will sometimes, like, lay on top of me in order to get me from, like, to make it so that I can't leave her room, right? And yeah, so something like that, one of those big, powerful aquatic mammals, I think would be fascinating to get inside the mind of.
Yeah, that is a fantastic answer. I love that. And yeah, just getting to play with them, getting it on their level would be great.
I have a friend, and this is quite an extraordinary thing. You talk about, like, just amazing stories. So they bought a boat, and they're naturalists. In fact, they are some of the people that I worked with on the projects on the Condau Archipelago that later inspired The Mountain in the Sea. But they're marine biologists in general. And they were on the Sea of Cortez or somewhere else. I think they were actually just off the coast of California, and they saw a bunch of floats basically moving around on the surface of the water. And they realized that it was, after watching this for a while, a humpback whale that had become entangled in discarded fishing net, and was dragging and could not dive because its fins and face were tangled up in this fishing net. And my friend Paul, who is an amazing person, jumped off of the boat with a knife and swam over to that humpback whale. And you'd imagine the size of this thing, right? Which is like school buses long, and carefully, over about a period of an hour, climbed all over it, swam all around it, cutting this net off of the whale, and finally freed it completely. And then swam back to the boat, and the whale actually swam under the boat and then breached, basically, to sort of thank them before swimming away. And they have video of some of this. It's really amazing. I kind of mention it because when people ask me, like, there's a lot of people who would really like to be writers, and there's always people who want to be in your shoes. And when they ask me, like, what I would like to be, it's like, I would like to be the person who was brave enough to dive in with a diver's knife and free a humpback whale.
Yeah.
Right?
Like, who doesn't want to be that guy? That's a genuine superhero move. That's amazing.
I was like, Paul, like, for the rest of your life, you can now do whatever the hell you want, and your karma is safe, right? Like, like, you can now be the worst person that you want to be. Like, you are safe in the eyes of whatever it is that determines, who is good and who is bad on this earth, right? Such an extraordinary thing.
I could just imagine him meeting new people and sitting them down and watching an episode of Blue Planet, and just in the really quiet bit, just going, I saved one of them. And then just leaving it like that.
Right. Exactly.
Amazing.
But he said while he was doing it that the whale clearly understood what was being done. Right. It was very, very aware that this person is helping me, and was actually rolling on its side and doing things that allowed him to get better access to really difficult places to cut. And there were things that he had to do to it that hurt it, right? And that were not pleasant. But it was clearly aware that he was helping and grateful to him and cooperating with him. And I think that's, it just goes to show how little we know about the beings that we're sharing the planet with. And again, like, I'm also not like a hippie, and I'm not like trying to say this in like this hippie way, but the reality is there's so much intelligence out there outside the human species, and we've barely grazed the surface of it. And if you just take a second and start thinking about these things, it does fill you with a sense of wonder, right? People talk about science fiction and wanting to find that sense of wonder. And I think that's why I keep feeling drawn back to writing about animals. Is it fills me with a sense of wonder, and difference. I mean, the core idea of The Mountain and the Sea was to write a first contact novel that was as realistic as I could possibly get, with a species that was closely related to species that we have on planet Earth. And the idea was that if I could do that successfully, I could answer a lot of questions for myself about the difficulties of establishing that kind of communication, but also give people a more realistic sense of wonder, right? And then also one that pulled them back into re-engaging with life on this planet.
Yeah, and because I think that one of the other things as well is, about this book is that, we're thinking about extinction, and we're talking about an animal that isn't there anymore, with the mammoth, and something that de-extinction of bringing it back, and it just got me thinking about sort of like all of the wonder that we have over animals that have gone extinct. Like my little one is obsessed with dinosaurs, and he's just there's so much awe about them.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about, what if you again were given the chance to learn and to study an extinct sort of species, if it could be brought back, besides the mammoth, is there one that you would particularly like latch onto and think, oh yeah, this would be really cool to study this?
I mean, a sort of sideways answer is, I think what fascinates me is not like the mammoth itself, but the extraordinarily long interaction that human beings had with the mammoth. And what I think would be really interesting would be just to see that whole world and the ways in which humans and mammoths interacted in it, and the woolly rhinoceros and the cave bear and all of these gigantic animals in this much colder world. I mean, and you're talking about thousands of years of living side by side with these creatures and having them sort of be these enormous presences in your world that were necessary for your survival, and then probably for things like coming into adulthood, right? Ritual ideas about what they meant to your universe and the group of people you were with. I think what would be really interesting to resurrect is just the feeling of being in that world as a human. Because remember, and this is the thing that I think we have a lot of trouble imagining. Everyone has trouble imagining this, and I have trouble imagining it too. These people that we're talking about that were living in the Ice Age, right, alongside the mammoth, had the same brains we have, right? So they were perfectly capable of all of the complex thought that we're capable of, although they may not have had the same technologies and means of expressing those things that we have, and they didn't have the same sort of, certainly, technological shell around them protecting them from their environment. These were people with rich internal lives, living in a much richer, in some ways, a much more dangerous environment. And it would be fascinating to just, if there was a creature from an extinct animal, in a sense, that I would like to get to know, it would be the humans, right, who lived in those times, whose way of life is extinct, and whose sensibilities are gone, and whose worldview is now lost to us. I think to really go back in time and just not be around them, because I think that would probably be terrifying. but to be able to observe them from a safe distance, right? I think that would be fascinating, because I think with that, what we would learn is that being human has meant really different things at different times, and what it means to be us and to be this kind of animal has really changed over the eons, so that it is both parts of it are still recognizable, but there are many things that we would find completely alien to us. So it would be a little bit like an encounter with an alien species as well.
Oh, that's such a cool answer, and I love that the answer is humans. That's just so perfect. And my son would disagree. He'd say T-Rex. Come on, Ray. But yeah, give us the dinosaur book. That would be amazing. I'm well up for the Ray Nayler dinosaur book. It's on the topic you said earlier about your daughter coming in and splaying on you and for attention. I know that there's some beautiful things that you say about your daughter and your family in your acknowledgements. And I'm a dad of a coming up 3 years now, is my little one, and there were some parts of the book that really resonated with me just from the point of view of parenthood. I just want to read it's no spoilers or anything, but just a couple of lines from the book, and it's chapter 3. This first one is strange how a life forms from those incidents, how an adult can have so much impact upon the path a child takes, how an adult could give a child a gift without knowing what pathways it would open, what potentials it might reveal. And when you were writing that, were you has that been influenced by your experiences as a parent? Do you think some of the themes that are in this book?
Yeah, so I should say, I've been drinking out of this like cup the entire time, which is like this really goofy Christmas mug. And the reason that I have this, that I'm still drinking out of this mug, even though it's the middle of January, is that my daughter Lida made this for me for Christmas and painted it like herself at one of these little pottery places where you can paint pottery and they'll fire it for you. And I'm not willing to give it up yet. Even though it's seasonal and I should probably put it away, I just can't do it yet. I'm very aware of two things, and one is like just how formative the environment is of a child, and the second one is of how unpredictable the impact of any kind of environment is on any individual child. And so, one of the great and confusing things about being a parent is like just this feeling of not knowing what impact whatever it is that you're doing, will actually have. I mean, you have if you're a good and caring parent, basic things that you should and shouldn't do, but you don't really know, like, okay, if I introduce this book, what pathway is that gonna lead them down? And I always say that I really do owe my writing to my mother, and who taught me to read when I was really young, but not just that, who introduced me to Shakespeare in this really rigorously thought out way, where we would like read a short version of a play and then discuss it and then go and see it and then talk about it again, and it was like this her sort of way of schooling me in what she felt was the most important English writer, and how deeply that imprinted on me, to the point that like when I was like I said, having a lot of trouble getting out of high school and juvenile delinquent. I still was a very strange juvenile delinquent who drove from California to Oregon to the Ashland like Shakespeare Festival every year to go and watch Macbeth, and I was thinking about that, these things that adults can do that give you a sense of story for your life, that become these objects or events around which your identity starts to take form. And I can remember some of these things. I think all of us have these memories that feel really formative. And I can remember, for example, very clearly being in an outdoor performance of Macbeth and the sort of the hand washing scene, right? With Lady Macbeth, and it being this warm summer night, sort of full of crickets, and the audience just being completely still with this like tension, right? Watching this woman on the stage who like half the time is giving lines, but the other half of the time is just wringing like her hands and communicating with her body, like all of this feeling. And I wonder if it, if it wasn't like that moment that made me want to be a storyteller, right? Or moments, or a few moments like that. And it's so tenuous, right? Like who we become just hangs on a thread. And I think later on we backfill, and it seems like there's a logical narrative to our lives. Like, oh, clearly, like I'm here because of this, this, and this. But I, in particular, my own like story presents me with like an opportunity to think about how things could have been otherwise, because my mother and father got divorced. My father was a French Canadian, and I was born in Quebec, as I mentioned. And at some point, when I was 3 years old, traveled down to the US. He was actually living in California with us. He took me on a visitation and kidnapped me and took me back to Canada on the train. And it took a few months for my mother to actually find out where I was. She had to travel to Canada, hire a private detective, and go and like find me to get me back, which she did, of course. And then she had to basically, because the Canadian government and the government of the province of Quebec at the time didn't recognize her parental rights, she ended up kidnapping me effectively, right? And taking me back to the United States. And so when I think back on that, what I sometimes feel like is there is this shadow self, right? That never returned from that and wasn't found, and grew up, a French Canadian 4 hours north of Quebec City, and in around Lac Saint Jean, where I was born. And that is there's no way for me to imagine that person is very much like I am, right? So it's kind of like it's one of those moments, a little bit like when you almost get into a very serious car accident, or something like that happens, when you have this kind of splitting of the self and you think about what could have been. I've always had this sense of the arbitrariness of life, right? The way in which things could always be very different, and the way in which we sort of lie to ourselves and tell ourselves that things are this way because they were meant to be, when really so much of it is probably happenstance, right? And so, yeah, that moment that you're speaking about, and that you quoted from in the book, which is returned to several times, in the book, I think is me expressing that feeling of what feels often in retrospect like fate actually having been quite arbitrary.
Yeah, totally. And as well, we were talking earlier about the conversation that you have when you're writing, and I kind of feel like it's within this scene. There's also that responsibility, that like the care that was taken by your mum is in there, because later, a couple of paragraphs later, you've got lines like, was it, he needed someone to take care of him, Damira's mother said, wiping a finger along the dust on the top of the refrigerator. We all do. That's part of this. So you're not just writing one perspective, are you? When you're writing, you're writing everything, like we talked about earlier, and with drawing and writing. It's such a brilliant scene that really informs the rest of it. I loved it. It was great. Final question that I want to ask you, Ray, is based on another quote that is from chapter 10 in the book, and it's a very simple question, but it's not. It's, what does it take to get a mammoth to be a mammoth? And my question to you is, what does it take to get a human to be a human?
Yeah, that's funny, because that's almost identical to a question to something that I've found myself sort of musing about myself, that sometimes it seems like the hardest thing of all to do is just to live your own life, kind of the way that you think would be good or right. Like it is really difficult just to cut a minor path, through there's like thickets of like not being sure about things and not knowing what to do next. And I think what it takes is there's sort of a concept I've been playing with that I've been calling, the new realism, right? And what I think the new realism really for me means is simply this, that we're coming to a time as a human race where we're far more knowledgeable and more aware of our impact on this planet than we ever have been. Human beings in the past have done really terrible things. I mean, 8,000 years ago, human beings drove the mammoth to extinction, which is a terrible, terrible thing. But the difference between them and us is really clear. The difference is they could not have known what they were doing. They absolutely could not have known that they were capable of killing the last of these enormous creatures and causing extinction, or even what extinction would be for them and what it would mean for the planet. And the sort of metaphor that I come up with for myself is, if you were walking past someone who was dying, right? And you didn't know that they were there, and you walked past them and you continued about your business, that would not be a moral issue, and it wouldn't be a stain on your conscience. You might later feel bad that you hadn't known that that person was there, but you did nothing wrong, right? And that is the person, interacting with the environment in 1950. They just don't know, right? Nobody knows what plastics are going to do. Nobody knows what a lot of these things are going to do to our world. But if you walked past someone and they were dying and you knew it and you didn't stop to help them, it becomes a moral issue and it becomes an ethical issue. And it says a lot about you as a human being. And that, I feel like, is the best way that I can explain why we have a responsibility that other people who came before us may not have had. It's because we're aware of the suffering that the things we're doing are causing, and we need to change our behaviors. And it's an ethical and a moral responsibility that previous generations may not have had. And so, what does it take for a human to be a human? I mean, I think it takes engagement with the world, and it takes us stopping to really try to peel back the layers of our actions and their impacts. And it's hard, it's demanding, it's not really it causes great discomfort, right? Just on a personal level. I mean, it's sometimes you just want to do something without thinking about it, and I understand that, but I think we don't have the excuses that people had before us. And so whatever it is that it takes for a human to be human, we had better get on it.
Yeah, that's a great answer. That's really good. It's a little bit like, if knowledge is power, then with great knowledge comes great responsibility.
I mean, there's so many of these, they become these kind of aphorisms that you can almost like dismiss, but that whole concept, with great knowledge comes great responsibility, is absolutely right. If you spank your kid, right, in the 1970s, then you haven't done really anything wrong, because everybody spanks their kid in the 1970s, right? And but if you're doing the same thing now, knowing the kind of negative impacts it could have on them, it's a very different story, right? And that is with great knowledge comes great responsibility, right? We know things about child psychology that we just maybe didn't know back then. It's a tough time for humanity right now, because, like I said, we're being confronted with our limitations and with the real impact of our actions on the world. And we lived in a fantasy world before, a limitless world of potential. When people ask, where's my flying car, right? Flying cars are a thing of innocence, right? Flying cars exist in worlds where people don't have flaming cars coming spinning, crashing down into their buildings because of the irresponsible but inevitable use of flying cars, right? Unfortunately, there's good reason for a lot of those technologies not existing.
Yeah, it's like if we can't even get the self-driving car right, then imagine the flying car. It's like, it's nuts.
I was standing on my at my balcony window the other day, imagining like the horror of actual flying cars in a city like Washington D.C. and thinking like, thank God that never never became a thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, who would feel safe through a window?
Yeah, exactly. Everybody would be paying extra for underground living. It's like
exactly.
Yeah, it's all the penthouse apartments. You'd be like dirt cheap. Yeah,
right.
Yeah. No, it's been absolutely great to Griffkin has just given us a comment. He says he wants a flying car. We're sorry to rain on your parade, Griffkin, but you know we got to be responsible. You know,
I do too. I want a flying car, and I swear I would be super responsible with it. I do. But maybe just me.
I want my pilot's license first, and then I want a flying car. And then another couple of comments that we've had. Just thank you for joining in, Ryan. It's great to see you. Really glad that you could make it with us. And as well, here we go. Griffkin, he says, can only imagine people trying to figure up and down signals. That's another one. Yeah, maybe they've got those on Mars. Maybe that's what they have. You know, so a stop sign means nothing to them. And then some more praise for you, Ray. Friends Talking Fantasy said, "Love The Mountain in the Sea." Very thought-provoking novel. I totally agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, and if you did enjoy The Mountain in the Sea, please do check out The Tusks of Extinction, because you will not be disappointed. It is a fantastic book that expands upon the themes that you enjoyed in The Mountain of the Sea, but does it in a new and a fresh and a brilliant way. So congratulations on the book, Ray. And are you excited now that it's out there in the world? It came out yesterday.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's always a little bit like there's a mixed feeling of excitement and anxiety, because you want to see how it hits, and is it gonna float? Is it gonna sink? Is it gonna, like what's gonna happen? But it's exciting. I'm really excited to get people reading it, and that's what's most important to me is just like it's getting the book into people's hands and starting that kind of conversation is a really wonderful feeling.
Yeah, well, thank you for writing it and for giving us it to enjoy and to converse with. And thank you for joining us, everybody. Thank you for joining me, Ray. If everybody has enjoyed our conversation and wants to connect with you or wants to give you feedback on the book or that kind of thing, can you just let people know where they might be able to reach you?
Yeah, so on Instagram is probably a good way to do it. I'm also on Threads. I'm on Blue Sky right now. There's a contact via my website as well. I'm not on Twitter anymore for many different unfortunate reasons, but that place just doesn't feel the same as it used to be, unfortunately. But I'm contactable at most social media, and it's always just Ray Nayler. I try to make it as easy as I can.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ray, and all the best with this one and with the next one too.
Thank you. Thanks.